The statement printed at 6:47 in the morning, and by the time the last page came through, I was already on page 3 with a yellow highlighter and a feeling I recognized from 31 years of sitting across from people who did not yet understand what their account was telling them. I am 65 years old. I have been retired for 11 months. I have not looked at anyone else's finances in almost a year, and the first time I sit down with my own. A Thursday in January, coffee going cold at my elbow, the kind of January morning in Shreveport that is just gray and still and indifferent. I find a charge I don't recognize at a restaurant in New Orleans, and then another one, and then a spa name I have never heard of, and then I turn to page 4 and I see a car payment. I did not call Camille. I finished highlighting. I paper-clipped all 12 pages into a manila folder, the way I always did at the branch when something needed to be looked at carefully, wrote the date on the tab in ballpoint pen, and then I picked up the phone and called the fraud department. I knew the manager there by name. I had worked with her for 6 years. I told her what I had, and I asked what form we were filing. She told me. I said yes to all of it. That is the whole of how it started. Welcome, friends. I've heard a lot of family stories in my years, but a daughter charging spa days and car payments on her mama's card for 7 whole months, and not a word said. Drop a comment below if that took your breath away. And if you're new here, subscribe. I have a desk in the second bedroom. What used to be Camille's room until she left for LSU Shreveport at 18 and never really came back to it. I converted it the winter after she moved out, not out of any statement, just because I had 40 linear feet of filing to do, and the room was there. That desk is a solid oak partner's desk I bought at an estate sale on Uri Drive for $200 and drove home in a borrowed truck. And it has sat in that room for 16 years with a banker's lamp on the left corner, and a letter tray on the right, and a cup of pens that are all exactly the same make, because I do not like surprises in pens. I had printed the statement the night before, actually. That is the part I keep returning to. I printed it the evening before, set it in the tray, and went to bed planning to go through it with my coffee in the morning. The kind of quiet routine I had been building since retirement. Deliberate, unhurried, mine. I had a 9 a.m. walk scheduled with Harriet. I had a library book half read on my nightstand. January was supposed to be uncluttered. I came to the desk at 6:40 with a mug of dark roast and the highlighter I keep in the top drawer. Avery Yellow. The same brand I ordered by the box for 20 years at the branch, because when you are going through loan documents, you want to be able to see what you marked without any ambiguity. I sat down, put on my reading glasses, and picked up page 1. The first 2 pages were ordinary: electric, water, my car insurance, the gym membership I had finally started using in October, a dinner at a restaurant I remembered. I turned to page 3. There was a charge from a place called Maison Dupré, not the hotel, something attached to it, a restaurant I believed. New Orleans. $2.50. I set the highlighter down. I picked it up again. I looked at the date. September 14th. I had not been in New Orleans in September. I had not been in New Orleans in 2 years. I highlighted the line. Then another New Orleans charge on September 15th, a spa called Glow and Restore on Magazine Street, $189. I highlighted that too. I turned the page. The number doesn't lie. That was something I said at the branch, not as a slogan, just as a fact, the way you state a fact to someone who is having trouble accepting it. A customer would come in with a story about how a charge couldn't be right, and I would slide the statement across the desk, and I would say, as plainly as I knew how, the number doesn't lie. The number is not your enemy. The number is just information, and the sooner you look at it clearly, the sooner you can decide what to do. I said it once a week for 30 years, give or take. I said it to myself on page 4, under my breath, when I found the car payment. It was listed as an auto draft, $487, dated October 3rd. Then again November 3rd, then December 3rd, then January 3rd. 16 days before I was sitting at that desk. 4 months of a car payment. That was not my car. I do not have a car loan. I paid off the Buick LaCrosse 2 years ago, and I have the title in the fireproof box in the closet. I did not move from the desk. I finished the statement. Every page. I took my time and I marked every charge I did not recognize with the highlighter. And by page 9, the page was more yellow than white, and the coffee was cold, and the 9 a.m. walk with Harriet was not going to happen. When I was done, I counted the marks. I added the amounts on a legal pad in 2 columns. The way I was trained to do it, 1 column for dates, 1 for figures, subtotaled by category. Restaurant charges, spa charges. Hotel. The car payment. 4 times. A few things I could not immediately categorize that I set in a 3rd column to research later. I added the columns. I added the columns again. $11,340. 7 months, September through January. I wrote the total at the bottom of the legal pad and underlined it twice, not for drama, just because that is how I have always marked a final figure. Then I paper clipped the statement into a manila folder, wrote January 2025 on the tab, and made the call. The fraud department manager, Denise Arsenault, picked up on the 2nd ring. I told her I was calling about my personal Visa account. I gave her the account number. I said I had unauthorized charges going back to September, and I wanted to file a fraud report. She pulled up the account. She asked if I had the charges in front of me. I said I had them itemized. There was a brief pause. The kind of pause a person makes when they recognize a voice from a professional context showing up in an unexpected one. And she said, "Roz, you want to press charges on this, or just the dispute?" I said I wanted to press charges. She said she would need me to come in and sign the formal complaint. I said I could be there by 10. I did not call Camille. I called Harriet instead, because Harriet had to know that the walk was canceled, and also because there are some things you do not sit with alone in a quiet house on a gray January morning if you have somewhere to put them. Harriet did not gasp. That is the first thing I will say about Harriet Odom Reese. She does not perform shock. She was a loan officer for 28 years, which means she has sat across from every configuration of human financial disaster that exists, and she has learned that the most useful thing you can be in the first 30 seconds is a person who does not need to be calmed down. "How long?" she said. That was the first thing. I told her 7 months. There was a pause. Not surprise. Something else. Something like the pause you make when a number confirms what you already suspected. Then she said, "Did you call the bank yet?" I told her I had an appointment at 10. She said, "Good, I'll come with you if you want." I told her I was fine going alone. She said she knew that, but she was offering anyway. We agreed I would call her after, and she would make the étouffée Thursday, and I would come over, and we would not talk about Camille if I didn't want to. What I have not said yet, and need to, is this. I was not surprised. That is the true part. The part that sat the heaviest with me as I drove to the bank that morning with the manila folder on the passenger seat. I was not surprised. I was clear. There is a difference, and the difference matters. And I had been a banker long enough to know what it means when the body skips surprise and goes straight to recognition. Camille has been borrowing against me in small ways for most of her adult life. I do not say that as an accusation. I say it because it is an accurate description of a financial pattern I participated in. I was the floor beneath her. When things got thin, she did not look for the floor. She assumed it was there. That assumption did not come from nowhere. I built it. In 2019, she called me in March with a credit card bill she said had gotten away from her. She didn't say how much at first, just that it was bad. I asked her to tell me the number. She said $3,200. I asked her to read me the statement. She did. I sat at this same desk with this same yellow highlighter, and I went through it with her on the phone, charge by charge, the way I used to do with customers in financial counseling sessions at the branch. Half of it was groceries and gas, and the ordinary expense of a life that outran its income. A quarter of it was dinners out and some clothing purchases, and a weekend in Hot Springs she had mentioned to me in passing. The last quarter I asked her about directly, and she gave me answers that were almost explanations. I paid it. I transferred $3,200 from my savings to cover it. I did not ask to be repaid. I told myself it was a gift, which is the word you use when you want to avoid the word loan. I did not attach conditions because conditions led to conversations I did not want to have, and not having difficult conversations was, I understand now, its own kind of expense. The year before that, 2018, she had asked me to co-sign the lease on the house in Bossier City. She was 31. She'd been in 3 apartments in 4 years, each time a new story about why the previous one hadn't worked out. The Bossier City house was supposed to be stable. More space, good neighborhood, closer to a yoga studio she was hoping to teach at more regularly. I went through the lease. I noted that my income, my retirement income, by then only 2 years away, would be listed as a co-signer's guarantee for a 5-year lease with a 2-month deposit and a penalty clause for early exit. I thought about it for 2 days, and then I signed. The lease was still technically in my name. That was the piece I was thinking about on the drive to the bank. Not with anger, just with the particular clarity of someone going through a balance sheet and seeing, for the first time in a long time, all of the columns at once. I pulled into the bank parking lot at 9:52. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, the folder on my lap. The building looked the same as it always had. Brick, low slung, the drive-through lane on the side I had watched from my office window for 20 years. I had spent more waking hours in that building than in any house I had ever owned. I knew the smell of the lobby. I knew the sound the vault door made when it sealed. I went inside. Denise was waiting. The formal fraud complaint took 45 minutes. I knew the form. Form 4506 fraud, internal designation. 2 copies, 1 for the institution and 1 for the account holder. Cross-reference to the police report number once that was filed. I had walked customers through this process many times, and I had seen every version of it. The elderly woman who had given her card number over the phone to someone she trusted. The man whose son had borrowed and kept borrowing. The woman who came in having discovered, on her anniversary, that her husband had been running a separate account for 3 years. The difference, sitting on the other side of the desk, was that I did not cry. I noted this without particular pride. It was simply information about my own state. I was functioning. I was precise. I answered Denise's questions the same way I had always answered questions at work, directly, in order, without editorializing. She asked if I had a list of the disputed charges. I gave her the itemized legal pad. She asked if I recognized the billing addresses. I told her the New Orleans Hotel and the spa on Magazine Street were September charges. The car payment drafts were registered to a vehicle I could not identify by name, but the last 4 digits of the account number appeared to be, I checked the legal pad, consistent with a Chevrolet dealer loan. She typed. I watched her type with the particular attention of someone who has watched bank employees type for 3 decades and can read the pace of keystrokes. She said the investigation would take 10 to 14 business days. I said I knew. She said in the meantime they would suspend the account and issue a new number, and any open drafts tied to the old number would be flagged. I said I understood. She asked if I wanted to file with Shreveport PD simultaneously or wait for the bank's investigation to run first. I told her I wanted to file simultaneously. She nodded and told me who to call. I filed the police report that same afternoon. The officer who took my statement was young, 26, maybe 28, and he wrote everything down carefully in the way of someone who takes the task seriously. He asked if I knew who had used the card. I said I had a reasonable belief that I knew, yes. He asked if I wanted to name them. I gave him Camille's full name and address. I did not elaborate. I said I had a documented history of charges going back to September, and I had an itemized list if he needed it. He took the list. I did not call Camille that day, or that evening. I drove home along Uri Drive the way I always drive, past the Brookshires where I do my regular shopping on Wednesdays, past the dry cleaner I have used for 12 years, past the turnoff to Fenwick Court that I have been making for 22 years. The azaleas in front of the house were bare, too early in the year for them, and the oak tree in the side yard had dropped its last leaves sometime in December. The house looked the way my house looks. Kept. Plain. Mine. I heated up the rest of Tuesday's red beans and rice and ate at the kitchen table with the newspaper. I did not check my phone more than once. I slept without difficulty. I am not saying this to present myself as someone without feeling. I am saying it because it is accurate, and accuracy is the only thing I know how to be. What I will tell you is that I thought about Camille the way I used to think about difficult cases at the branch, not about the person's character, but about the pattern of what she had needed, and what I had provided, and what the providing had cost, and what the cost had looked like from her side versus mine. She had not, as far as I could determine, thought of it as stealing. She had thought of it, I believed, as borrowing from a source that had never gone dry and had never asked to be replenished. That belief was not crazy. I had established it. I had been establishing it incrementally for the better part of 15 years. The difference between us was that I had been keeping records. 3 days after I filed the reports, a Sunday, I sat down at the desk again with the folder and went back through the statement. Not to add anything new, just to understand the full sequence. Denise's office was processing the investigation, and I had given them what they needed. But I am the kind of person who does not consider something fully examined until I have done the examining myself. I had the legal pad next to the statement. I had a second legal pad for notes. I had a cup of the dark roast and the early morning quiet that I have come to think of as the one genuinely good thing about retirement. No alarm, no commute, no schedule until I make one. I started with September. The New Orleans trip was September 13th through the 15th. I knew Camille had gone to New Orleans in September. She had mentioned it to me on the phone sometime in late August, said she and Trace were thinking of going down for a long weekend. I had not thought to ask how they were funding it. I was 3 months into retirement. I was thinking about whether to repaint the kitchen and whether I was ready to join the genealogy group at the library, and I was not tracking Camille's expenditures because Camille was 37 years old and her expenditures were not my business. The hotel was the Maison Dupré on Chartres Street, $640 for 2 nights, double occupancy rate. The restaurant on Friday was $214.50 for 2, what looked like a dinner with wine. The spa on Saturday morning was $180 for what the statement listed as a couple's deep tissue and salt scrub. A second restaurant on Saturday evening, $287 with tip. Sunday brunch, $94. Total for the New Orleans trip alone, $1,424.50, plus incidentals I may have missed. I wrote that subtotal on the legal pad and drew a box around it. Then I moved to October. October was quieter in terms of individual transactions, but had the first auto draft, 487 Zoreros, October 3rd, labeled only as Gulf Coast Auto Finance. I circled it in red pen. That was new. The car payment had not been on the September charges, which meant the card had been set up as a payment source sometime between mid-September and early October. Someone had sat down with a laptop or a phone and entered my card number into a lender's payment portal and pressed submit. That takes about 90 seconds. I have done it myself. I wrote, "Trace?" in the margin of the legal pad, not accusingly, just as a question. Then I wrote, "Car payment, not mine." 4 months. $1,448 total. The total I underlined. In October, there were also 2 restaurant charges in Shreveport, places I recognized, a Mexican restaurant on Line Avenue and a sushi place downtown, a grocery charge at a store in Bossier City, a charge from what appeared to be a plant nursery, Bayou Bloom, I didn't know it, for $67 ears. I noted the nursery charge as the one that bothered me in a way I couldn't immediately explain. There was something about buying plants on someone else's card that seemed so ordinary, so unexamined, as if the money were simply flowing through a pipe with no one on either end of it. November had a spa charge from a different place. Serene Aesthetics in Shreveport, $220, a clothing purchase I couldn't pinpoint by description. The second car payment, another restaurant, a charge for something I eventually identified as a monthly subscription to a meal delivery service. 159 drawers, with one prior month also visible once I knew to look for it. By page 9, as I have said, the page was more yellow than white. I finished the full accounting by 10 in the morning. The totals by category were as follows: dining and restaurants, $1,847.50. Spa and personal care, $698.00. Hotel, $640.00. Car payments, $1,948.00. Grocery and household, Bossier City addresses, $412.00. Subscription services, $318.00. Retail and clothing, $461.00. Miscellaneous, $814.50. Grand total, $11,139.00. The additional $201 I had not initially been able to account for resolved 2 days later into a second meal delivery service under a different name. $11,340. I wrote $11,340 in capital letters at the bottom of the second legal pad and underlined it twice. Then I set down the pen and looked out the window at the side yard for a moment. The oak tree, the brown January grass, the neighbor's cat sitting on the fence the way it always does in the morning. Then I made another cup of coffee and started making a list of the things I needed to tell my attorney. I want to tell you something about the car payment because I think it is the detail that matters most, and I have not yet told it fully. I found out whose car it was on the 4th day. My attorney, Barbara Mouton Graves, a woman I have used for 12 years and who has a small practice on Texas Street and keeps a framed print of the Louisiana state seal behind her desk that I have always quietly liked. She had requested the full account documentation from the bank as part of the legal consultation. The documentation came back within 2 days, which was faster than the standard timeline, and I believe was the result of Denise Arsenault knowing who had filed the complaint. The Gulf Coast Auto Finance account was registered to a 2021 Chevrolet Silverado, financed through a dealership in Bossier City. The account holder was Trace Fontenot. I sat with that for a moment. Not with anger, with the particular attention I used to give to a document that required a second reading. Trace Fontenot had a truck payment of $487 per month, and for 4 months that payment had been drafting from my Visa account, and I had to determine, because this mattered both practically and legally, whether Trace knew whose card was being used. The investigation would eventually establish that he did not. His name was on the auto loan but not on the payment portal account. The card was entered by someone else using a login registered to Camille's email address. His lack of knowledge did not, as I have said, entirely resolve the question of his responsibility. A man whose $487 monthly payment has been covered for 4 months without his asking where the money came from is a man who did not look. That is not the same as fraud, but it is not nothing either. What the car payment told me, and this is the thing I kept returning to, was that this was not impulse. You do not set up an auto draft on someone else's card by accident. You do not do it in a moment of poor judgment. You sit down. You enter a card number you have either memorized or written down. You confirm the payment, and then the following month it drafts again, and the month after that. 4 times. You receive a confirmation each time, presumably to Camille's email, and each time you do nothing about it. This was a decision she made in September and continued to make through January. 7 months is not a lapse. 7 months is a policy. Friends, when I heard about that auto draft, 4 months of Trace's truck payment coming out of Roz's account, my stomach dropped. This wasn't a slip-up. This was a choice made over and over again. What would you have done in Roz's position when that truth became clear? I thought about calling Beverly that night. Beverly, my younger sister, has lived in Baton Rouge for 20 years and has kept a careful neutrality about Camille for most of them because I asked her to. We talk twice a week, and I have edited the Camille conversations for as long as I can remember, giving Beverly the version I was comfortable with, which was usually not the full version. She is 2 years younger than me, and she is sharper than she lets on, and she has been watching me manage Camille for a long time from a polite and deliberately maintained distance. I called her on the 5th night. I told her the full version. She was quiet for 2 seconds, not stunned, just arriving at something she had been circling for a long time. And then she said, "What do you need?" That was it. Not, "I knew it," which she could have said, and which I would not have resented, and which would have been accurate. Not, "What are you going to do?" which would have required me to perform certainty I wasn't fully feeling yet. Just, "What do you need?" I told her I didn't need anything yet, but that I was telling her now, so she would know. She said she understood. She said she was coming up the following weekend, and she would bring something from Hadel's bakery, because it was February, and because Roz hadn't been eating right, she could hear it. I said I was eating fine. She said she was coming anyway, and she did. Harriet came on Thursday. She made her mother's crawfish étouffée the way she always makes it, in a Le Creuset Dutch oven she has used for 30 years, with a roux that takes 45 minutes of standing at the stove with a wooden spoon, the way her mother taught her, and the way she will not shortcut, regardless of what she is going through. Her kitchen smells like a particular combination of the Creole Trinity and something faintly sweet that I have never been able to identify and have given up trying. I have eaten in that kitchen 100 times, and I will eat in it 100 more. We sat at her table with the étouffée over white rice, and we did not talk about Camille for the first 40 minutes. We talked about whether she was going to visit her daughter in Atlanta in March, and about the book she had just finished, a history of the 1927 flood she had picked up at the library sale, and about my azaleas and whether they were going to make it through what had been a dry winter. Harriet grows things. She has a Meyer lemon tree on her back porch and a raised bed of herbs and a Confederate rose she has somehow kept alive for 16 years, which I regard as an achievement bordering on the improbable. Then she said, "Tell me the full number." So I told her. $11,340 over 7 months. The New Orleans trip. The spa charges. The car payment in Trace's name. The meal deliveries. She listened without interrupting, which is one of her gifts. She was a loan officer for 28 years and she knows that numbers tell a story, and that story needs to be told in sequence, without decoration, for it to mean what it means. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The car payment is the one." I told her I thought so too. She said it had the feel of someone who had been doing the small things for long enough that they stopped noticing the size of the things. I said that was about right. She said she had seen it at the bank. Not fraud exactly, but the casual appropriation, the gradual redefinition of where one person's resources ended and another's began. The number doesn't lie. I said it out loud, at Harriet's table, over the remains of the étouffée. Not for effect, just because it was the most accurate thing I knew to say. And I had been saying it for 31 years, and it was still, as far as I could determine, true. Harriet looked at me and nodded, and said, "No, it does not." What I meant, and what I think Harriet understood, was not just the 11,340. I meant the other numbers, the $3,200 from 2019. The co-signed lease from 2018, which had a monthly liability of $1,450 attached to my name. The drive to LSU Medical in Shreveport in 2021, when Camille had what she called a bad episode, and I spent 11 hours in a waiting room and did not mention it to anyone for 3 weeks because she asked me not to. The 40-mile round trip to Bossier City for Thanksgivings and Easter Sundays, and the occasional Sunday when Camille called and said she could use a hand with something, and it was always something I could have said no to, and never did. None of those things are line items. None of them would go on a legal pad. But they are numbers in the way that things that cost you over time are numbers. They accumulate, they compound, and eventually they have to be accounted for. I had been keeping those accounts privately, in the way people keep accounts that have no formal ledger, and I had been carrying the running total for long enough that I had stopped noticing the weight of it. What the statement did, with its 12 pages and its yellow highlighting and its boxed subtotals, was put the weight back outside of me where I could see it. Barbara had the folder by then. The fraud investigation was running. The police report was filed and assigned to a detective whose name I had written in my contacts under Shreveport PD. Fraud. I had nothing to do, legally, but wait. So I ate my étouffée. I finished 2 glasses of Harriet's sweet tea. I drove home on the still, cold, clear streets of a Shreveport February evening and let myself into my house and fed the neighbor's cat, which has taken to appearing at my back door at irregular intervals, despite not belonging to me, and which I have been feeding since November, because it showed up one evening looking thin, and I am not, it turns out, entirely without sentiment. The fraud investigation took 12 business days. Barbara Mouton Graves called me on a Tuesday afternoon with the preliminary findings, and I sat at the desk with my legal pad and took notes the way I always take notes when someone is giving me information I may need to refer to, in full sentences, not fragments, with the date in the top right corner. The bank's investigation had confirmed all charges as unauthorized. The card had been entered into the Gulf Coast Auto Finance portal using login credentials linked to an email address associated with Camille Weller Fontenot. The other charges, the restaurants, the spa, the hotel, the delivery services, had been made with either the physical card or the card number entered manually into digital payment systems. The physical card had last been in Roz's possession when she stopped using it regularly, approximately 8 months prior to the first unauthorized charge. She had switched to using a debit card for most purchases during retirement, and the Visa had been sitting in the bottom section of her wallet, still valid, essentially dormant. That detail. I noted it on the legal pad and looked at it for a moment. Camille had not used a card I was actively monitoring. She had used the one sitting quietly in the bottom of the wallet, the one I would not notice in the normal course of reviewing my spending because I wasn't spending on it. She knew my habits. She had grown up watching them. She knew I would not look at a card I wasn't using. I wrote. She knew I wouldn't look. Then I drew a line under it and set down the pen. Barbara told me the next step was the DA's office, which had received the police report and the bank's documentation and was reviewing the case for possible charges under Louisiana Revised Statute 1467. Theft by fraud. The amount, over $500 and significantly over $2,500, placed it in the range of a felony designation if the DA chose to pursue it. I asked Barbara what, in her experience, was likely. She said these cases were pursued about 60% of the time when there was clear documentation, a named party, and a family relationship. She said the family relationship sometimes worked in the defendant's favor with prosecutors. It sometimes worked against. She said she would keep me informed. I asked if there was anything I needed to do. She said I might receive a call from the detective assigned to the case, and I should take that call and answer everything the way I had answered everything else. Clearly, without embellishment, without trying to protect anyone. I said I would. What I did not say, what I have not said to anyone directly, not to Harriet, not to Beverly, not to Barbara, was that not protecting Camille from the consequences of the fraud report was not something I had to work up to. It was not an act of will. It was just the next accurate step in a sequence I had set in motion, and each step in that sequence was no different from the steps I had taken at the bank. You file what needs to be filed. You answer the questions that are asked of you, and you let the process be what the process is. I had spent 31 years teaching people that their accounts were real, that the numbers were not abstract, that consequences were the natural result of financial decisions, that the kindest thing you could do for someone in financial difficulty was tell them the truth about where they stood. I had given that counsel hundreds of times, and I had believed it every time. I believed it now. I just believed it on my own behalf, which was a different and less comfortable position. Beverly came up that Saturday. She arrived at noon in her Camry with a box from Hadel's Bakery, a Mardi Gras king cake, purple and gold and green icing, the kind with the baby hidden inside that I have found in my piece approximately 3 times in 65 years. She put it on my kitchen table and said she wasn't leaving until we had gone through all of it. The paperwork, the folder, the whole sequence of the last 2 weeks. We sat at the kitchen table for 5 hours. We went through everything. She did not cry. I did not cry. At one point she said, "How long did you know something was wrong before this?" I thought about it honestly and I said, "Since the lease, maybe before." She nodded. Neither of us said anything for a moment, and then she cut us both another piece of the king cake, and I found the plastic baby in my piece, and we both laughed, and that was the first time I had laughed since the Thursday the statement printed. Camille found out on a Wednesday. I know this because Beverly told me, not because she was monitoring Camille, but because Camille called Beverly first, the way she always calls someone adjacent to me first, to take a reading of the temperature before she faces the source. I was not in the room for that conversation. Beverly told me only what was necessary. That Camille had received a call from the detective assigned to the case, that she had been informed of the fraud report and the open investigation, and that she had told Beverly she did not believe her mother was actually serious, and that there had to have been a misunderstanding. I sat with that phrase for a while. Not serious. As if the fraud report were a mood I was in. As if the manila folder and the legal pad and the appointment with Barbara Mouton Graves were the kind of thing you do when you are upset and then think better of once you've calmed down. This is the part I want to be accurate about. I was not in a mood. I was not upset in the way that passes. I was the same person I had always been. The person who read every document twice and kept the records and told you exactly what your account contained. And I had applied that person's standards to my own situation and arrived at a conclusion that was as clear and as stable as any conclusion I had ever reached at a mahogany desk in a bank branch on a Tuesday afternoon. I was not going to stop. I did not call Camille that week. I received 2 messages from her. One the day she found out, and one 3 days later. I read both of them. The first was short. Just that she needed to talk to me. That this wasn't what it looked like. That there had been a misunderstanding she could explain. The second was longer. I will not reproduce it word for word because it is hers, but the shape of it was a recounting of the ways she had been struggling, a suggestion that she had believed I was aware of her using the card, a reference to the difficulties of her life in a way that positioned them as context for the charges rather than as separate facts. It was not quite an apology. It was the kind of message someone writes when they are still hoping that the problem can be reframed rather than resolved. I read it on a Sunday morning at this same desk. I set my phone down and I looked out the window and I thought about what she believed, genuinely believed, I think, about what kind of account she held with me, that it was open-ended, that it was replenished automatically, that there was no balance to maintain, because the balance was, in her understanding of the world, always sufficient. She was not wrong that I had taught her this. She was wrong that it would continue indefinitely. The co-signed lease came up at the bank the following week. With a fraud case open against Camille and her credit situation in flux, the landlord's bank flagged the co-signer liability. Barbara notified me. It was a complication. Not a crisis, but a piece of paperwork that would require attention. I noted it on the legal pad. Trace, I learned through the investigation, had come in voluntarily to give a statement about the auto draft once his name appeared in the documentation. He said he hadn't known. The detective, a careful woman named Doris Prejean, who called me twice with updates and spoke in the measured way of someone who has handled family financial cases before, said his account was consistent with the digital records. He wasn't named in the complaint. He was a man who had benefited from a thing without asking where it came from, and the investigation had established the limits of his involvement, and the rest of his situation was between him and his own conscience. I have heard from people who have gone through something like this that the hardest part is not knowing what the other person is experiencing, being outside the consequence, looking in. I will say, honestly, that it was not hard for me in that way. I was not outside it. I was the center of it. I had set it in motion, and I understood what it was setting in motion, and the particular piece of that, of knowing exactly which form had been filed and exactly what would happen next, was the same piece I had felt for 31 years every time I closed a case correctly and moved on to the next one. What I felt, if I am accurate about this, was tired. Not tired in the way of wanting to stop. Tired in the way of a woman who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally set it down and is feeling, for the first time, the full weight of what she had been carrying. Spring came early that year. The azaleas were out before the end of February, which in Shreveport is not unusual but always surprises me. The way a small mercy surprises you when you have been in the middle of something difficult. The ones in front of the house are the variety called Formosa, a deep magenta that I have never been fully prepared for no matter how many springs I have watched them come in. My neighbor Martha Delacroix, who has lived 2 doors down for 15 years and grows things with the intensity of a competitive sport, always stops when they're in bloom and says, "Roz, those are too much." I think that is a compliment. The DA's office notified Barbara in late February that they were moving forward with a charge of felony theft by fraud, RS 1467, for the amount of $11,340. Camille would be arraigned. Barbara told me the timeline and I wrote it on the legal pad. Then I put the legal pad in the folder and the folder in the fireproof box in the closet, because there was nothing more I needed to do with it that day. Camille called me herself the day after she was notified. I let it ring the first time. She called again 20 minutes later and I picked up. I had decided before the call that I would speak to her once for as long as was necessary and not longer, and I would be factual, and I would not argue. She said, "Mama." I said, "I'm here." She asked if I understood what this would do to her. I said I understood that there were consequences to the fraud report. Yes. She said she hadn't meant. She said she had been struggling. She said she thought I knew. She said she didn't understand why I hadn't just called her first, why I hadn't given her a chance to fix it. Her voice was the voice of someone who is genuinely frightened and also genuinely confused, and the confusion was the part that stayed with me after. She genuinely believed there was something to fix. She genuinely believed that if she had known the conversation was coming, she could have said something that would have changed the sequence. In 23 years of banking, I had sat across from people in every variation of financial consequence, and the ones who were most difficult, not the most dishonest, the most difficult, were the ones who believed that a conversation after the fact could substitute for accountability during the fact. I said, "Camille, I don't have anything to add to what Barbara Mouton-Graves has told you. If you have questions about the legal process, she's the right person to answer them." She said, "So that's it? You're just going to let this happen?" I said, "I reported the fraud. The process is the process." Then I said, "I have to go now." And I said goodbye, and I ended the call. The whole conversation was 4 minutes. I sat at the desk for a while after, not thinking about Camille, exactly, thinking about the house. 22 years on Fenwick Court. The oak tree in the side yard that I have watched through 3 hurricanes. The kitchen where I refinished the cabinets myself in 2009, because I wanted them white and I had a long weekend and no reason not to. The desk I drove to an estate sale to get. The azaleas I did not choose. They were there when I bought the house, but have tended every year regardless. This house is mine, not in a legal sense only. In the sense that every decision about it, from the color of the kitchen cabinets to the filing system in the second bedroom, was made by me and paid for by me and is accounted for to me. There is a particular kind of peace in that, and I had not been giving it its full name. Harriet came for lunch on Tuesday, as she had the 3 Tuesdays before. She brought a container of her chicken and andouille gumbo. We sat at the kitchen table and she asked how the call had gone. I told her it had been 4 minutes, and I had said what I needed to say. She said, "Good." Then she said, "The gumbo needs more file powder. Tell me honestly." I told her, honestly, it did not. We finished both our bowls. The arraignment happened in March. I was not there. I did not need to be, and Barbara had not suggested it. I was at home on a Wednesday morning when it happened. At this desk, with my coffee, writing a letter to a woman I had been corresponding with through a genealogy exchange, tracing a branch of the Thibodeau family back to the late 1800s in St. Mary Parish. It is the kind of slow, careful work that suits me. Following a thread patiently through records, correcting what has been mislabeled, putting things in their right order. I had been doing it since October, and it had become one of the more satisfying things in my retirement. Barbara called at 11 to tell me it had gone straightforwardly. Camille had entered a not guilty plea, which was expected and standard. The preliminary hearing was set for 6 weeks out. Barbara said there was a reasonable chance of a plea agreement before it came to that, given the documentation and the amount involved. I asked what the plea would likely look like. Barbara said probably restitution, a suspended sentence, and a period of probation. She said it depended on the DA and on Camille's attorney. She said I would be consulted if there was a proposed agreement that required my response. I said I understood. I thought about what the word restitution contained. $11,340 returned to me in a payment plan I would almost certainly be waiting on for years. That was one number. The co-signed lease, still carrying my name, still a liability, now in the process of being formally resolved as part of the credit complications that had followed the fraud case, was another number. The $3,200 from 2019. The years of quiet accommodation that I had chosen and that Camille had accepted, and that neither of us had named for what they were. I was not going to get most of that back. Not in money. Not in any other way that could be quantified. I knew that, and I had known it since the morning I sat with the highlighter and the statement. What the fraud report had given me was not recovery, it was accuracy. It had put the numbers in their right place, in the right ledger, with the right names on them. What Camille owed me legally was $11,340. What she owed me in the larger sense was not something a court could order repaid, and I had made my peace with that in a gradual and not particularly dramatic way during the 5 weeks between January and March. Beverly called that evening. I told her about the arraignment. She said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it and said, "Accurate." She said she thought she knew what I meant. I said, "It's like closing a case file. The numbers are where they belong now." She said, "Then that's enough." I said yes. It was. There was a message from Camille a few days later, longer than the first two, more formal in its phrasing, which told me she had had it reviewed before sending. It acknowledged, in language that stopped just short of direct admission, that she had used the card without authorization. It said she was sorry for how this had affected our relationship. It asked me to consider, when the time came, whether there was a path to restoring what she called our connection. She used the word mama 3 times. I read it twice. I noted the precision of its phrasing. Sorry for how this affected, not sorry for what I did, in the way you note a particular construction in a document without yet deciding what to make of it. I did not reply. I did not delete it either. I put my phone in the desk drawer and went and checked on the azaleas, which were past their peak now and beginning to let go. The blossoms going papery at the edges the way they do in April. I have not stopped loving my daughter. That is not a complicated thing to say, and I want to say it plainly. I love her. I loved her when I filed the fraud report. I love her now. Love is not the same as continuing. It is not the same as absorbing. It is not the same as providing a floor so reliable that it gets mistaken for the ground itself. She is finding her own ground now. That is not comfortable for her. It is real. May came. The plea agreement was offered and accepted. Restitution of $11,340, payable in monthly installments over 48 months, beginning July 1st. a suspended sentence. 18 months of supervised probation. The co-signed lease in Bossier City was formally removed from my name the same week, through a process that involved a credit adjustment and a letter from the landlord's attorney and exactly 2 phone calls from Barbara. I signed a document. I received a copy of the release. I filed it in a new folder. Green tab this time, not manila, labeled Bossier City Lease, resolved. The balance of what I thought I would feel in this moment versus what I actually felt is something I keep coming back to. I had expected some version of relief, the clean, full breath kind you feel when something you have been waiting for finally arrives. What I felt was quieter and less defined. Not relief exactly. Completion, maybe. The same thing I felt at the bank when a long-running account issue was finally documented, closed, and moved to the archive. Not satisfaction in the triumphant sense, but the particular satisfaction of right order. Everything where it belongs. Harriet came for lunch on a Tuesday. She brought a bottle of sweet wine from a vineyard in Texas she had visited with her daughter. A Blanc du Bois, which I would not have expected to like and which was, in fact, good. We sat on the back porch because May in Shreveport, if you catch it before the heat arrives, is one of the finer things available. The neighbor's cat, I have started calling it Cicero after some private logic that I cannot entirely explain, was on the fence in the sun. The Meyer lemon tree in Harriet's yard, she had told me, had put out 47 lemons this season. I said, "How do you count lemons?" She said, "Carefully." I told her about the plea agreement. She nodded and poured more wine and said, "And the restitution payments?" I said they would start in July. She said, "And if they don't?" I said Barbara had that covered. She nodded. She said, "You did what was accurate." I said, "Yes." She said, "Not everyone can do that." I said I knew. What she meant, I think, was not that it was difficult in the way of requiring courage or resolve. She knows me well enough to know that the call to Denise Arsenault was not a hard call for me, that the filing of the police report was not a hard act. What she meant was that it requires a particular kind of clarity to apply your professional standards to your own life, to look at your own account the same way you would look at a stranger's, without the habit of self-deception that most people rely on to make the numbers more comfortable. I had been precise about other people's money for 31 years, and imprecise about my own in certain private ways, and the cost of that imprecision had accumulated over time the way costs do when they are not accounted for. The folder with the original statement, the one I had taken to Barbara, had been filed at her office. I had a copy in the fireproof box. It would stay there. That is where documents go when they are closed. I called Beverly on a Sunday in May that was all open sky and the smell of cut grass from somewhere down the block. She asked how things were. I told her the plea was done. The lease was resolved. The first restitution payment was on the calendar. She said, "Roz, how are you actually?" I thought about it for a moment and I said, "I'm fine. I think I'm actually fine." There was a pause and she said, "I think so too." Then she said she was coming up in the fall and we should go to the Festival of Arts on Cane River and make a weekend of it, and I said yes, and we planned it, and we talked about nothing important for another 30 minutes, which was the best possible thing. I have not seen Camille. We have not been in the same room since December, before any of this. I do not know what that room will look like when it happens. Whether it is a holiday table or a phone call first, or some other slower reopening that takes time, I am not going to try to predict. I know I love her. I know what the numbers said. I know, more than I have perhaps ever known, the difference between the two. July. Shreveport in the summer is serious. The heat is not dramatic. It is just thorough. The kind that settles in every corner of every room and makes the inside of a parked car into something you approach with strategy. I run the ceiling fans I have had in this house for 15 years, keep the shades down until late afternoon, and I have taken to sitting on the back porch in the evenings after 7, when the light finally softens and the air is something you can be in without effort. The first restitution payment arrived on the 2nd of July, one day early. A cashier's check, $236.25, made out in Camille's name through the probation office. Barbara had told me how the system worked. The payments would come through the probation coordinator, not directly, and I would receive confirmation of each one. I did not stare at the check. I noted the amount against the repayment schedule I had written out on a fresh legal pad. 48 months, $236.25 per month, and put it in the deposit stack on the corner of the desk. I have a new Visa account, new number, opened in February after the old one was suspended. I use it for regular purchases the way I always intended, monthly, paid in full, no balance carried. I received the statement electronically now. I switched in April, finally, because Barbara suggested it and because I had been meaning to for years. I print it once a month and go through it at this desk on the first Saturday morning of every month. The same ritual as always. Coffee, reading glasses, the same Avery yellow highlighter I have been buying for 30 years. I went through July's statement on a Saturday in early July, and every charge on it was mine. The gym membership I have been using 4 times a week since October. The grocery order from Brookshire's. Dinner with Harriet on a Friday at a Vietnamese place on Uri Drive that she had been wanting to try for months, and that was, as she had predicted, excellent. The library's digital lending subscription, $11.99 a month. A bookstore charge from an afternoon in June when I drove to Baton Rouge to see Beverly, and we spent 3 hours in a used bookshop on Government Street, and I left with 4 novels and a sense of having spent an afternoon in exactly the right way. Every number familiar, every number mine. The number doesn't lie. I have said that in 3 different registers now, across a desk to a stranger, to myself over a yellow highlighted statement, and silently, this morning, looking at a balance that represents what I have, and no more than that, and no one else's claim on it. The number doesn't lie. This one is the one I have been working toward for 31 years, though I could not have told you that until recently. The balance on my own account in my own name, accurate and closed and completely mine. I cut up the old Visa card one morning in the kitchen. I had been meaning to do it since February. It had been sitting in the top desk drawer, expired but not yet destroyed in the way of things you mean to get to. And I did it one Tuesday in July, when I happened to be standing at the kitchen sink with scissors in hand for another purpose. I cut it into 4 pieces, the way they always instruct you to. 2 lengthwise, 2 across. It took about 4 seconds. I dropped the pieces in the trash can under the sink and went back to the coffee I had left on the counter. And that was the whole of it. No ceremony. No moment of reckoning. Just the end of an account number that had done what account numbers do. It had held the record, and the record had been examined, and now it was closed. Cicero the cat is on the fence this morning. Harriet is coming for lunch on Tuesday. Beverly is coming in October, and we are going to the Festival of Arts, and she has already identified 3 restaurants she wants to try. The azaleas will come back in February. Formosa variety, too much, exactly right. I am at my desk on a weekday morning in July, the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, the blinds half open on the side yard where the oak tree is full and dark green, and exactly where I left it. The statement is open in front of me. Every line is mine. The balance at the bottom of the page is what I have. I know it to the dollar. I have always known it to the dollar. That is the one thing about me that has not changed and will not change. The number doesn't lie. It never did. I'll tell you what I'd have done, the same as Roz. But I'd have made that call to the fraud department the same morning I found that first charge. 31 years of watching people look away from their own numbers. She finally looked at hers. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me why. And share it with someone who needs to hear it.